So at that time, my cousin, who was also a doctor, you know, he was a doctor then, but he was a spy for the British government, but we all didn't know that.
What was your cousin's name?
Dr. Gozano, Eddie Gozano. He was a spy, but we didn't know that then. And the cops came to get him.
These are the
Japanese cops, and the person who came to get my cousin was my mother's dentist, a Japanese dentist, and my mother was so upset, you know. But anyway, then they took my cousin away, and I don't remember whether he came before my father died or after my father died. That's the part I don't remember.
They took your cousin.
They took my cousin away. Must have been before, because there was no doctor in the house when my father died.
Eddie Gozano.
Eddie Gozano. He was taken into camp. With his brothers was in another camp, but he went to another camp. Anyway, then we couldn't bury my father. And we didn't know what to do, because you can't buy a coffin. So my mother remembered my father had back problems, so he had bed boards. So she had the men go to our house and take off the bed boards from my father's bed, and they built it in the backyard. They built the coffin and buried my father in the Chinese cemetery that was across from the high Waterloo Road, and buried my father there. You know, it was a very scary moment for me, and to this day I remember my father's death, and I would never see anybody die, never. I have not seen a single person die. I would leave. My mother was dying and I left the hospital. My sister was dying, I left the hospital. I couldn't see it.
So what happened?
And after that, the Portuguese government were very good, and they decided to, then we moved from there, because my mother didn't want, you know, we moved from my aunt's house, and they were going to, because we went to our grand aunt's house in the corner of Waterloo Road and Homerton Street, because we were sent to Macau. The refugees were sent, and I think we were my mom and my sister and I were all the first people to be registered for that, because my mother's friend was Julia Suarez. She was Korea, actually. Her husband was Korea, and they were the representatives of the Portuguese consul. And Julia worked with my mom at Low Bingham and Matthews, so they were very good friends, and they took care of us. You know, we were very fortunate. They took care of us, and we went to Macau, and we could each only carry one big suitcase.
When did you leave for Macau?
I think we left in February. My father died in January. Between January 3rd and February, I don't know which date, we had no food. So, but the Japanese people, the Japanese had a headquarters on Homerton Street. So my mother made me go with my cousins. You know, see, I guess I've always been very, very daring. As a child, I was always daring. So I would go to the Japanese and ask them for food. You know, see, never thought I would be a beggar, right? And that's the days, yeah, I was a beggar. We went.
How did they treat you?
Very nicely. They loved children. See, that's the one thing, they were so nice. And they would come and visit us and bring us chocolates and stuff.
The soldiers?
They were around the corner. These are not soldiers, these are officers of the Japanese government. They were very good. And they used the garages as their stables. And so we had food. We had oatmeal, and we had different things like that. To this day, I cannot eat oatmeal. So this is what it is. They gave us food. So, but one of the Japanese officers, his name was Captain Suzuki. I will never forget his name, because he came to our house a lot. And he told my mother he would like to adopt me. And my mother was so anxious to get to Macau, because she wasn't going to give me up. And he said, because I have a daughter, your same age as your daughter. told my mother that
Now,
in Japan.
how would he adopt you?
I don't know. I don't know how he was going to take me back with him when the war was over. And my mother was so anxious to leave Hong Kong. But anyway, we went to Macau. When we went to Macau, it was very sad for my mother. Because my mother was a wealthy woman in Hong Kong. She lived, her house was right next door to the government palace, you know. She was very wealthy. They had 10 servants in the house when they were growing up, you know. And we had to go to Macau as refugees. We went to a refugee camp, and it was Luso Chinesa. It's a school they gave to refugees. And we were there unloading and looking for a location to sleep when my cousins came. My cousins lived in Macau, my mother's cousins. They came to the Luso Chinesa, the two ladies that we never met before because we've never been to Macau.
These are the Alvarez cousins.
The Alvarez cousins, my mother's first cousins. The last names were Garcia. And because their father was a colonel, my grand aunt was married to a colonel. And they lived 2 doors down from my mother when my mother was growing up. And they still live there. That was their house.
And did they accept you?
Oh, they wanted us to come to their house. So they moved the whole family. The whole family, my uncle, your grandfather, and his wife, and the kids, all the kids, and my aunt and her husband. By that time, her husband was out. You know, he was already reunited with his family. We all went to Macau.
How many were there?
Therefore, well, they had 4 children, and you people had 5 children, and my mother had 2. So we all lived there. But my grand aunt loved my mom. My mom was the firstborn. You have to remember, in the Latin family, the firstborn is always the most precious. So my aunt wanted my mother to sleep in the room with her. My grand aunt was blind. My grand aunt was blind, and she was fabulous. I will never forget her. She had my mom and sister sleep in my aunt's bed, and she slept in the other bed, and they had a cot for me because, you know, I was 10 years old, you know, and they lined it with newspapers so that it won't be cold. And she remembered, she was blind, she's 90 years old, she remembered what she had in her cupboards. She remembered in the 3rd drawer of that cupboard in that room, there are 3 blankets, would you please bring them? She told her daughters. And you know what? That got my mind thinking, and this is why I am so organized. Okay? I will tell you, that's the reason why I always think of her when I'm doing organization. And I was 10 years old then. And so we went and stayed at their house. And we slept with my aunt, my great aunt, in her room. And finally, the kids were downstairs, and you know, kids are kids. They weren't allowed in the living room, but kids are kids. They still went to the living room, and it was too much for them. You know, 3 old people. You know, finally they were all staying in the basement with the rooms for them, and everybody was kind of makeshift. You know, and there were many rooms that we couldn't go to because they were doing some import-export things or something like that. They had little things that, well, we all got into, especially your dad. He was the worst of the lot, and we would go in there and mess the whole place up, and finally we knew we couldn't stay there anymore, you know. So we decided to move to a house, you know, and my uncle and aunt went to a refugee camp. I think it was called Luso Chinesa or something like that. I can't remember the names of the places, but they went there, and we went to stay in a house called Travessa dos Anjos. It was a tiny little house with 2 bedrooms. They had 1 room and we had 1 room, and the bigger kids slept in the living room, kind of, you know, very small house, and no downstairs, you know, and when it was raining, we had to open our umbrellas, and we had we had little buckets waiting for the rain to fall into the water to fall into it. Anyway, and there were rats in the house. They were so big that you could hear them thumping down, going down. And when you cut the rats, you threw them out, people would eat them so fast. They were so hungry. So finally we couldn't stay there anymore because it was too much, so we had to go to
How long were you
a
there?
refugee camp. I don't think too many months. Mm-hmm. And we went to a refugee camp called Bella Vista. And that's where we stayed. And my uncle, your grandfather, had a room because he had a family. Mm-hmm. My mother, my sister, and I stayed in a dormitory with all these women who bickered all the time. And I was still 10 years old. I was little then. Still remember all these little things that went on, Maybe I was 11. I can't even remember when.
So you were 10. What did you do? What did you do during the day?
We went to school.
Uh-huh.
We went to Santa Rosa de Lima school. Of course, we were refugees, so we didn't have to pay tuition, The nuns were very good to us. We all went to school there. And in fact, my mother had gone to school there herself, So we went there to school. And pretty soon, we was been in Bella Vista for a long time. And my poor mom, she had to endure all this hardship, because she had never been home before. My mother was a working mother,
Right.
We forget that my mother's a working mother. She doesn't know how to do any housework, period. So what she did, there was no housework to do anyway. So she used to go down to the basement with all the women, and they used to pick the rice because the Chinese would fill it with sand and stay to make it heavier, Mm-hmm. And every day we had food, but it was a terrible food. It was pumpkin almost every day. Pumpkin.
Squash? Pumpkin?
Squash.
As a vegetable. Did you make soup?
Yeah, soup, sometimes, I don't know what it was. Anyway, I hate pumpkin. To this day, I don't even eat a pumpkin pie. Anyway, it's something that we lived with. But we had a lot of fun because there were lots of kids there. Mm-hmm. We had boys and girls and all. I was growing up in Bella Vista, so I think I was 11 when I went there, and we stayed many years. And we found we had cousins we never knew we had, And it was just something that you can't take back, So we stayed there until the war was over. And when the war was over, we were very worried because my mother had no job. Everybody went back to a job, but my mother didn't have a job. But Julia was in Hong Kong at that time.
Who's Julia?
Julia Suarez. Remember, she was working with my mother at Low Bingham and Matthews. And all the people from Hong Kong, all the British were sent back. Oh, and the refugee, I forgot to tell you about the volunteers came too. They sent the volunteers in ships to Macau to see the families. That was a nice thing.
They didn't incarcerate they didn't jail the volunteers?
No, the volunteers were let go, but the British took over. Remember, the war was over.
Oh, this is
in August, yeah.
This is when the war is over.
Well, the war's over. This I'm telling you, the war's over. Well, the same thing happened all the time when the war was happening, During the war, we were all there for 4 years. Mm-hmm. And so when I was 14 years old now, by this time, and so my mom couldn't go back because we didn't know where we were going to go because we had no place to go. Yeah. My father had died and we had no home, and my mother didn't have a job. So Julia worked with my mom at Low Bingham and Matthews. That's why I mentioned it in the beginning. And she was there, and she said to my mom, they sent a cable to my mother and asked my mother, please come back and open the offices of Low Bingham and Matthews. Thank God for education. Okay, this is where education comes in. So because all the British were sent back to England, they all had to go back. So my mother went back to Hong Kong in a junk with Chinese people in the junk all the way from Macau to Hong Kong. And my sister and I were left with the maid. We still had our maid who was very faithful to us, and she stayed with us, and we had we stayed in a Hotel Central with my uncle, your grandfather, and my aunt and the children, and we were together until we could go back to Hong Kong. When my mother came back to Hong Kong, she stayed with her brother because my uncle was there, and my uncle said, you send the family back and stay with me. He was a bachelor.
What was your brother's name?
My brother's name is Jose Alvarez. He was a bachelor.
Okay.
And he stayed in Hong Kong the whole time. You know, but so my mother, we went back to Hong Kong and we stayed with my uncle. We stayed in a 1-bedroom. And he had 1 bedroom, and he also let the lady who owned who lived in the flat before stay in the other bedroom. So there were 3 bedrooms, and we stayed there for many years. And my mother at that time was trying to recuperate. You know, we lost everything. We had nothing actually. We only had our beds, because what happened when we were in Macau, my cousin Lino Gozano, he came to Macau and brought the maid, who was very faithful to us, and the beds, my mother's 2 beds. So that's all we had, were the 2 beds and my maid. So when we went back to Hong Kong, of course we had the beds, you know. The beds went back with us, and we stayed in my uncle's house. We stayed in my uncle's house, and we were going to move, but we never had money to move. We didn't even have money to buy a refrigerator until finally we did buy a refrigerator. And then my uncle got married, and it wasn't hard to live with another woman in the house, you know, for my mom. But my mom went to work every day, and my sister and I went to school, and we still had our maid, you know. After a while, my mother opened the Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong.
Oh, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, my mom was very active at the Chamber of Commerce. In fact, when my mother retired, my mother was given a trip to Portugal, all the way to England, and back to Hong Kong.
So back up just a little bit. How did she get involved with the Chamber of Commerce right after the war?
Because of the late Low Bingham and Matthews. Remember, I told you they were kind of a sponsor for the Chamber of Commerce, and so they had my mother do all this work, because my mother knew everything about the business. My mother was very efficient. You know, she was a businesswoman. Even in those days, you know. So she was the first woman to work in Macau, remember? So she knew all these things. So she did that. She did that for the Chamber of Commerce.
So she helped other businesses get us reestablished in Hong Kong after the war.
Chamber of Commerce. That's why when my mother retired, and they gave my mother a pension, and they gave her cash, and they said, you go to England and you have a good time, and then you come back, and you can stay in Hong Kong, and you have your pension, that you can live in Hong Kong comfortably.
Can you tell me what businesses she helped in Hong Kong after the war?
You see, after the war, we couldn't have Chinese imports into the United States. Do you remember that? There was a embargo or something like that. I don't remember things like that, but I was still young, you know. I mean, it didn't bother me. But the thing is, you couldn't import. So my mother had to sign all those certificates that it was not made in China.
While she was in Hong Kong?
In the Chamber of Commerce. That was her job. My mother signed all the certificates for that. So the Chamber of Commerce people loved my mother, you know, and they called her Mrs. M, you know, and it was very nice, because all the bosses just really loved my mom. And when my sister and I both graduated from commercial school, we were both given jobs at the Chamber of Commerce. You know, so was my cousin Francisca Marcus. She was also offered a job at the Chamber of Commerce. My mother helped her get the job.
How old were you when you got your first job?
My first job? I was pretty old, because I missed school quite a bit, you know, a year or two, and but because, you know, I wasn't a very happy child, you know.
Still?
I wasn't very happy in Macau.
During the war?
Yeah, and I was kind of sickly a little bit, and so was my sister. But my cousin Eddie, by that time, Eddie Gozano, during the war, they had taken him to jail, right, to prison. and he escaped. He escaped and went through China, and then he landed back in Macau. He came back to Macau, and so he was a doctor for all the Portuguese people. And so we were very lucky that we had him. He took care of my mom, my sister, and I the whole time we were in Macau. You know, and so during the war, then after we went back, of course, everybody came back to Hong Kong, and my cousins came back too. But my mom still didn't have too much money, you know, and so we stayed with my uncle, and we saved our money. She says, my father said that we must go to Europe, because Europe, everybody has to travel to see the world, to see what it's like. So she said to my sister and I that we always had to save our money to do that. So my sister and I did. We did. When we went to work, my mother took no money from us, but we had to put our money in the bank. So we saved our money. The two of us saved our money so we could go with my mom. My mom was given the trip, but we weren't. So we had to pay for our fare to Europe. And it was a good thing, in fact, that my mother was not, she didn't get her visa to come to the United States. Oh, she told them, I don't want to come back to Hong Kong because I want to go to the United States, because I want that for the future of my children. And besides, you know, my sister had gotten a scholarship. When we went back to Hong Kong, she got a scholarship to come to the United States to school. But my mother couldn't afford to send her here, because even though you have a scholarship, you have to pay for the fare and you have to pay for living expenses. So she couldn't afford to do that. And she said, you know what, we will go to the United States and you can go back to school. Told my sister that. So anyway, we decided that we would come to the United States. And one of my cousins was here in San Francisco, Jerry Guzano, and my other cousins were all in Los Angeles. You know, right. All your grandfather and everybody, you were there too. Right. And so my mother said we will do that. So when we came home, when we came to, what did we do? Oh, and then she told them, so they said, okay, we will pay for your trip all the way to the United States, and you don't have to come back to Hong Kong. You can live in the United States if you want to. But my mother didn't get a visa, because she was born in Macau, and my sister and I were born in Hong Kong. Even though my mother had a British passport, she couldn't go back. She couldn't come.
How long did it take her to eventually come to the
Well, she had to wait 4 years, because what happened is, well, she went to Portugal, so we all accompanied my mother to Portugal. And we went to Portugal. My mother stayed in a pension. She didn't want to live with her cousins. Her cousins were all there. You forget that my grandfather's family, you know, all went to Portugal. All the Garcias.
After the war?
After the war, they all went. The Garcias and you know, my mother's aunt was married to the governor of Macau, and they lived in Portugal. Of course, the governor died, and everybody, you know. So I know that my cousin's name was Flavio, something or another, but I can't remember. I think it was, I don't remember the name, because of the governor's name, you know. But they lived in Macau, in Portugal. So we went to Portugal and met all my cousins from my mother's side. In fact, one of my cousins is an engineer. I think he had something to do with the bridge that they just built, because when I got married, I got a cable from them congratulating me on my marriage. And my mother was still in Hong Kong, in Macau, in Portugal.
So after you got married, she came?
Yes. See, when I got married, my husband asked me to marry him, and I said, no, I have to check into this first. Because I really had to, because I wanted to make sure my mother got here. You know? I said, I have to be here for 5 years so that I'd be a citizen, so my mother could come, because they wouldn't even let my mom come here, because she had already applied to come and stay, but she couldn't come even on a visitor's visa, even though we had money to pay for her to come. So we decided, well, my husband said, why don't we get married, and then you know, we can send for your mom. And I thought, I don't want to do that just to get my mom here. No, it's kind of it's like using somebody, and I'm not that type of a person. I thought, then finally he convinced me that I should do that. Okay, so we did get married without my mom. It was so sad.
And this is...
And I only had my mom, my sister and I, you know.
Tell us...
Okay, so when we arrived here, we didn't come here directly. We went to Portugal and we flew over London. We went over the poles. We went to Iceland and we Keflavik Airport. I forget the first time we saw snow. And then we flew over and we went to London. And I have cousins in London. So I loved London. I really love London. I still love London. And I got a job there and in those days was BOAC, it's not British Airways. So I was ready to go back there, really, to work there. And my sister wanted to come here because, remember, she thought maybe she could go back to school. So anyway, she came. And I just promised my mom that I would come with my sister and make sure she was settled. So, and I wanted to get my American papers, you know.
Right.
So I came with my sister and we stayed here. No, we went to Los Angeles first. We thought maybe we'd stay in Los Angeles, you know, but we decided not to because you had to drive. And we could drive and there was no way we could go. You know, Los Angeles, no car, no go.
You didn't have a car? No.
Of course, we just arrived. We didn't have money in the first place. But my mother had cash. Remember, they gave my mother the cash.
Right.
So we had this big check that we had carried with us. And it was very funny. So we went to the bank and deposited the check. And we didn't know what to do. We deposited it with the Bank of America so that we didn't know what we were going to do. So when we were there, we arrived January 22nd in England and stayed until the 27th. Then we left and came to Los Angeles.
What year was this?
1960. 1960.
And when did you decide to...
We left Hong Kong in November 1959. We went to all over. We went to, not in any order, Singapore, Colombo, Karachi, India.
I've seen pictures of you on camels in Egypt.
That's right. And then we went to Egypt, we went to Cairo, we traveled a lot. My mother, I'm so happy my mother traveled. We went to Italy, we landed in Italy. We went on an Italian ship and landed in Napoli. And then the ship took us to Capri too. So we went to Capri and we went all over.
So how did Uncle Bernard eventually convince you to marry him?
How did he convince me? Well, I loved him. Let's put it this way. So I decided, yeah. See, I was very careful about marrying anybody because I didn't want to marry anybody who was going to divorce. And he liked all the things I liked. I always wanted to have a lot of children because I didn't want to have 2 children. Because it was pretty boring just having 2 children. See, that was always my sister and I. And all my cousins had so much fun because every weekend we'd go to my cousins' homes and had so much fun together. They played cards and they did things like that. And I wanted to do that, you know. So I told him all the things I liked and he told me all the things he liked. And it was the same things. He wanted 6 children and I wanted 6 children. And then we talked about it. And so I married him, and all the people that I met wasn't what I wanted. And I knew he was a good man, and I checked the family out too. I did. I knew a lot of priests and nuns because I had a very good friend who was a priest in Hong Kong, and he gave me letters of introduction to a lot of priests. So I checked with the priests about the family, and they were a good Catholic family.
And your mother, she was still...
And my mother was still in Portugal. See, my mother knew nothing about this. Okay. So I had to decide on my own everything. I had to pay for my own wedding and had to do everything. But it was so sad because I didn't have my mom here. I was very close to my mother and my sister. We were really close. And so I decided, yes, I will marry him. He asked, I met him in January, I arrived here in February, because we were in Los Angeles January 27th until February, beginning of February. And the first week I went to a young adult club, you know, because the priest insisted that I join some organization, of course. And so we joined, my sister and I, and we met these people. They were very nice, but not my kind of people. Let's face it, you're a Mac, you're a Mac. You know, it's hard to get used to other people. But finally, the priest was very accommodating. He made things, changed the club rules and things. They had dances so that we can get to know each other. And my husband asked me to dance the first time. And then he asked me if I would like a ride home. And he had his little brother with him who was 16 years old then, and Victor. And so Bernard took my sister and I home, but he took a bunch of people home, and he took us home last. And so his brother says, afterwards asked him, why do you take them? He says, I'm kind of interested in those girls, he said to his brother. And his brother said, which one? He thought that Bernard was interested in my sister because she was very quiet, and my husband was a quiet person. And he says, no, I like Margarita. So finally, so I saw him a lot. He came over and this and, but I still checked the family out, because I was not going to marry anybody who was going to dump me after a few days, because Americans are used to divorces. You remember that? This is all I know about Americans in Hong Kong. We don't mix with people like that. So I do know a few Englishmen, but I wasn't going to marry any English person, because I didn't want to go to England then. I didn't know anything about London.
But he convinced you.
But my husband convinced me, yes. Oh yeah, he was very good. And when my cousins arrived, Eddie Gozano came in May, because my mother told him they were going to go to Australia, to New Zealand, and they were turned down because Eddie's wife is part Chinese, and they wouldn't let them in, even though he was a doctor. But he was a member of the Urban Council in Hong Kong. And so he met a doctor who was on a visit from San Francisco, who was my cousin's doctor here, Dr. Garcia. And he was in Hong Kong, and he met my cousin, and he says, you come to San Francisco, I'll sponsor you. So he sponsored my cousin. So when we were on the ship coming to to Portugal, we got a cable from my cousins. We got our visas, see you in May. So they came in May, we came here in January, and they came in May. So when they met Bernard, when my cousin met Bernard, he says to me, I think it's time you settle down. He's very nice. He said that to me, and because I had lots of boyfriends. I was always on the go. I never sat down. I never had a moment's rest, okay? So he said, I think you better settle down. And so it made me think,